The opportunity to do something that very few people get the chance to do at age 60, and usually at age 30 or 40, and that is to go back and take the road not taken.
Howell Raines and Walter Isaacson on Book TV, Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2. In the Shia Revival, Council on Foreign Relations Senior Fellow Vali Nasr discusses the history of Shia Islam and its role in the future of the Middle East. This talk from the American Enterprise Institute in Washington is just over an hour.
My name is Susan Skarbal. I am a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of Carla Cohen and Barbara Mead and all the other booksellers here, thank you and welcome to Politics and Prose. This evening, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Vali Nasr, who is here to discuss his new book, The Shia Revival. To most Western eyes, all Islamic movements look alike. Surprisingly, there's been little written about the bitter divide between Shia and Sunni. Yet, without understanding their ancient conflict and its modern embodiment, it's impossible to comprehend current events in the Middle East. Professor Nasr is the leading expert on Islam who specializes in political and social developments in the Muslim world. He is a professor of Middle East and Southeast Asia politics and associate chair of research at the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. He has written several books and articles, including the recently published Democracy in Iran. On behalf of everyone at Politics and Prose, please help me welcome Dr. Vali Nasr.
Good evening, and thank you for that introduction. It's very good to be here and to talk about this topic. It seems like everywhere we turn these days, there is discussion of the Shia and Sunni conflict and the importance of the Shia to the region. Since 2003, this has become much important to public discussion. In Iraq, we saw increasingly the importance of the Shia, first as a new force that we encountered as we tried to sort out the different political factions in Iraq, and then gradually we saw that the entire enterprise in Iraq became mired in sectarian conflict, most notably since February 2006, when there was a destruction of a major Shia shrine. And now there's upwards of 100 people a day killed in sectarian violence, which threatens the unity and stability of Iraq. More recently, we have seen an upsurge of conflict in Lebanon, which involves the Hezbollah, which we for a long time had been a player in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but this time with a much more distinctly sectarian tone to it, not only because Iran, which is the most important Shia country in the region, is supporting Hezbollah, but also because the other sect in the region, namely the Sunnis, in the form of governments in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and also in the form of radical clerics in the Arab world, very quickly identified what was happening as a Shia push for power and tried to limit its popularity by playing the sectarian card. And then there is the issue of Iran, which has been with us for a while, and the U.S. attempt to deal with a rising Iranian power and influence in the region with the importance of Iran's nuclear program has been ongoing, and there have been and it has been a part of discussions about Iraq and other issues. But more recently, there is a recognition that Iran is connected to many other important issues in the region because of these ties that bind it, ties of sect, ties of identity that bind it with other communities in the region. So as we take stock of things, the most important conflicts that we are dealing with right now, the one with Iran, the one in Iraq, and the one in Lebanon, they are about different things. But there's one trend that runs through them, and that is this factor of a resurgent Shia identity and assertion of power and Sunni resistance to it. And my belief is that in many ways this is a very important new cleavage in Middle East politics that in some ways had always been there, but it was just below the surface. It was a fault line that was just below the surface. But since the Iraq War, it has come to the fore. And since it's come to the fore, it is important to all the other conflicts, and it is impacting them. And that we are dealing essentially with a new region whose makeup is different, and that every other issue that we have to deal with, the Arab-Israeli issue, issues of oil, issues of security, have to be looked at in that context. I think the Arab-Israeli issue is very instructive. It's probably the oldest, most prominent conflict in the region, but this time around it has a very clear sectarian tone, and this is completely new to this conflict. Now, this is complex in some ways because it is one of those issues that it is both old and new. It's a sectarian division, which, much like in Christianity, when we think about the division between the Eastern Church and Western Church, or between Protestantism and Catholicism, it seems to have some archaic roots at some point in history. It's about theology, it's about faith. It brings out, if you would, all historical memories and the way in which people relate to truths in their everyday lives, to their values and the like. And it's, in some ways, it is ancient. The Shiites and Sunnis parted way from one another right at the beginning of Islam. So in some ways, each sees itself as the original orthodoxy, much like the difference between the Orthodox and the Catholics. And the dispute was seemingly very political at the beginning, namely it was over who would succeed Prophet Muhammad. And whereas the Sunnis decided that the community would choose who would be the best successor, who would be the most eligible to succeed him in terms of qualities, the Shia believed that there was a spiritual essence to the Prophet that would pass through his progeny to modern times. In some ways, the Shias would very well understand the plot to the Da Vinci Code, the importance of bloodline. And they believe that the veritable leaders of the community were the descendants of the Prophet. Well, they lost that battle very quickly, namely the dominant form of government and religious authority in Islam fell under the caliphate at the time, and the Shiites dissented. And the faith consolidated, particularly when the grandson of the Prophet, the third Shia Imam, who's buried in Karbala, died a horrific death, standing up to a far larger Syrian army that was sent to subdue his claim to authority. And that event, much like the crucifixion of Christ, was a formative event for Shiites. And to this day, they commemorate that event on a festival of Ashura. And that saint's burial place in Iraq is the most passionately loved location for Shiites. And the theme of martyrdom, suffering, the standing up of the underdog before a far more powerful force have become important themes in Shiite life. And what most separates Shiites from Sunnis is not the minor ways in which they practice the faith differently, but it is that the passion and drama that is associated with the saints that Shiites hold holy, and the places of their burial which they visit, and all the ceremonies that are associated with it. These are issues of faith that have no reflection in scripture in Islam, but are very near and dear to Shiites. As there's an immediate, personal, direct, passionate relationship between Shiites and their faith. And this veneration of saints has a reflection, for instance, in Catholicism. In Catholics, looking at Shiites visiting Najaf and Karbala could see similarities with the visitation of the Shrine of Fatima in Portugal, or Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, or the very fact that the Shiites believe that saints have grace and their burial places have grace, and these are places you visit and pray and ask for forgiveness and the like. Those don't have reflection in Sunni Islam, which is in some ways more Protestant in its approach to faith. It's about the individual's direct relationship with God and the scripture, and you look at text more literally rather than try to read meaning into it, and there is no intermediary between man and God. Now, the Shiites and Sunnis have fought about these principles over time, and in many occasions they have also lived in coexistence and peacefully in many parts of the world. But the modern period has been particularly difficult, and particularly the past 5 decades in the Arab world for the Shiites has been particularly difficult. Namely, although they have lived as a majority and have ruled over Iran, in the Arab world, regardless of whether they were a majority or a minority, they were suppressed. They didn't have a seat at the table. They were not part of the political community, part of the family of the nation. They were always accused of being Iranian or having being loyal to Iran. Even most recently, the president of Egypt said that Arab Shiites are almost always, that means always, almost always are more loyal to Iran than to their own countries. And this myth of being beholden to Iran is obviously repeated with the notion that Hezbollah, even though it is very aggressively supported by Iran, but that it is completely controlled by Iran. Well, Iraq changed that in many, many regards, and in important regards. One is that Iraq, essentially by removing what was probably the most oppressive Sunni regime from power, and then essentially allowing politics to flow in the direction that the numbers would permit, allowed the Shias to assume power. In other words, they showed up to vote. Their Ayatollahs told them democracy is a good thing because you have the weight of numbers on your side. In fact, the Shiites everywhere have the weight of numbers. Even where they're a minority, still they'll get more than what they have today if they voted. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, in the eastern province, when there was recently elections, this is a Shia province, the Shiites participated by the ratio of 2-to-1 to Sunnis, and it's the very first time in their history that they actually are sitting on city councils, and one local Shia engineer said, "We vote to say we exist." And when this transition of power became from the Sunnis in Iraq to the Shiites became confirmed by a government that took over under Prime Minister Jafari, who was predominantly Shia, this was very symbolic. This was the very first time that there was an Arab Shia state. It has never existed in history before. Back to the beginning of Islam, there has not been a real Shia political entity. And the psychological blow of this to Sunnis, who have used over time, they believe that they represent Islam, they represent its political authority, they represent its religious authority, was very significant. And the fact that the U.S. obviously was the facilitator here did not endear the U.S. to Sunni insurgents in Iraq who faulted the U.S. for doing this. In fact, the Al-Qaeda terrorist Abu Musab Zarqawi would always pair the U.S. and the Shiites in his condemnation as the twin enemies, one within, one without, but whose enterprises were, sort of reinforcing. But the problem in Iraq was that it wouldn't stay there. Namely, what happened in Iraq has been important everywhere else, because Shiites everywhere in the Arab world saw the possibility of something better. Saw the possibility that political change can actually pass power into their hands. And they became far more expectant of change. And this, if you would, began a kind of fervor in the region that was disturbing. And the first element of Shia revival is really this political momentum among the Shiites in the region. They're not led by the same ruler. There is no more a single Ayatollah Khomeini who's leading them. There is no single movement. The issue is that everywhere in the Arab world, the Shias have the same problem. Therefore, their responses are the same. And so it's a movement of many different communities, all expecting political change to give them power. But Iraq also facilitated other things. It just opened the borders for pilgrims from Lebanon, from Iran, but particularly from Iran, as far away as Pakistan and India, to go visit the shrine cities. There were sort of new networks of people, business, trade began to be forged. And at the center of this was this most senior Ayatollah in Iraq, Ayatollah Sistani, who we always think of him in the context of Iraq, but his importance beyond Iraq has become quite noted. In other words, larger and larger numbers of Shiites in Iraq, outside of Iraq, have begun to adopt him as the Ayatollah that they would follow and give him their donations, their religious taxes and religious donations. And in him, if you would, you have the element of a web that is responsible for a cultural revival among the Shias. He's not alone, but this whole sort of network of clerics from Lebanon to South Asia, to Pakistan and India, is now very critical in bolstering this surge in identity among the Shiites. Now, in many ways, this was a serious challenge to U.S. policy, because when the U.S. went into Iraq, its expectation was not that it had to deal with the mutually exclusive political aspirations of two sects. It thought democracy was about individual rights. It thought of Iraqis as Iraqis, with the exception of Kurds, which we knew did not view themselves as Iraqis. But we never really thought that the Iraqi society may come apart in this particular manner, and that this would open very different attitudes towards U.S. presence and policy in the region between the two population groups in the region. And in many ways, we were not ready for it. And perhaps that our absence of readiness on our part allowed Iraq, which was the very first place we had a transition of power, to also become the most bloody example. In other words, this was not a good beginning. Likely to be a long process of gradual transfer of power from Sunnis to Shiites. And I think in many ways it did have a shocking, it was a shock to the Shiites as well. And that the ferocity of resistance to Shia assumption of power was quite a wake-up call. I mean, now we look at Iraq and we see that both communities are killing one another. But for the first 3 years, it wasn't that way. It was mostly attacks by insurgents on Shiites, whether they were policemen or new recruits to the army, or they were average citizens and the like. And the culmination was the destruction of one of the major Shia shrines in Samarra, north of Baghdad. And I think that was a breaking point for Shias. That they decided that, that restraint is interpreted as cowardice. And they decided to establish a balance of terror in Iraq. And things then began to go down a spiral. And we haven't been able to restore a situation of stability commensurate to what was before. Not that before was good, but it was not in a sort of a free-for-all. One response I think that the Shiites began to contemplate was that whenever the Shiites have risen in power in modern times, you've seen Sunni sectarianism of trying to corner them, marginalize them by calling them heretics, questioning their Arab identity or questioning their faith. And the Shia response has always been to look for those causes that can bring everybody together rather than pull them apart. And there is no cause better than that, than the cause of focusing attention on Israel. And I think it is not at least one dimension of Iran and Hezbollah's attempt to hijack the Palestinian cause is that it first of all focuses attention away from sectarianism, the rise of Iranian power, the rise of Shia power in the region, and focuses it on the common enemy. And it seems to have worked, because in the very first few days, radical clerics did their best to raise the sectarian issue, raise the image of Iraq, to convince the rest of the Arab world not to support Hezbollah. But for now, it didn't work. Secondly, I think the Shiites believe that by showing a strong face on the Arab-Israeli issue, they will earn the badge, the legitimacy of power. And I think probably the most important symbolism coming out of the current Lebanon war is that Hezbollah has defended its little village on the border far better than Saddam defended Baghdad, the seat of the great Abbasid power. And in a culture that has accomplishment deficit and in which sort of a muscular defense of rights and honor matters, it serves as legitimating the Shia claim that they have a right to power. And but by the same token, the Lebanon war has also elevated sectarianism beyond Iraq, mainly because of the reaction that Hezbollah received from official Arab governments and also from radical clerics, that they highlighted the fact that the Hezbollah-Iranian alliance is a Shia alliance, and that and tried to question the legitimacy of the Shia to speak for Arabs. And by so doing, it has essentially made sectarianism a regional issue. In other words, the Shia crescent about which King Abdullah of Jordan warned early in 2003-2004 now seems to have become a reality. But the problem is that whereas in 2003 there was an opportunity to probably harness the rising Shia force in the region in some manner in favor of the U.S., that moment is rapidly passing, and the more sort of anti-American voices among the Shia are coming to the fore, and that will cause instability. One hates to be a prophet of doom, but I'm not terribly optimistic that we've seen the worst of sectarian conflict yet pass, or that its full impact on the shape of the region is yet known. First of all, the settlement of power distribution in Iraq is by no means done yet. The big battle about who gets what in Iraq is yet to be fought out, and it's not going to be around the constitutional table. It's going to be in the street, and in some ways the battle for Baghdad has already begun, and that will likely write its own rules for Middle East politics. But I also think once the Lebanon war is settled, in other words, once there is a ceasefire, the whole issue of the Shia bid for control of the Palestinian issue and the Sunni response to it within Lebanon and within the region will actually come to the fore. Because in many ways, the Iranian-Hezbollah axis has been largely political in what it wanted to achieve. And that is not going to go without a response, a comeback from the other side in the coming time period. So for the U.S., the challenge, I think, in many ways, and I hope my book would contribute to that, is to understand what are the issues that are at stake. What is the historical backdrop? What is it that defines these faiths, and what is the historical legacy that each sect carries in terms of its memory of the other, in terms of what it believes it deserves and what the other one should get. And I don't think we can think clearly about the Middle East or formulate policy clearly about it without having a strong understanding of what does the sectarian dynamic in the Middle East today mean, and where is it going to take the Middle East in the future. Why don't I stop here and see if there are any questions.
Hi. Let's see, I've heard people talking about sectarian violence in Iraq, that it might turn into a civil war, and some people say that it's already started, and the dangers of that spreading. So could you comment on the possibility of it spreading and what it might look like and how much of a problem it could be?
Well, there are many scenarios that can happen. We often associate civil wars with very clear boundary lines, with two sides having organized regular forces. But civil wars, or better put, actually civil conflicts, can take many forms. In India, for instance, at the time when India and Pakistan separated in 1947, there were no militias. There was no battle line. There was merely killing in every community of Hindus and Muslims, and at the end of the day, some 2 million people died, and 2 countries were born out of it, and many more, close to 10 million people lost their homes or were displaced. So we may end up, if you would, in a conflict that is just going to bleed Iraq until there is a de facto division, or you may actually have a far larger eruption where you go from 100 people dead per day to a far larger numbers, and actually the militias may begin to engage much more directly.
Is it the absence of what we're accustomed to in the Western world insofar as democracy is concerned that the Shia and the Sunni do not see resolving their differences in a so-called democratic process? They don't have any history of following that procedure?
Well, it's not only absence of history, there's absence of constitutional mechanisms. Democracy is about rule of law, it's about power sharing, and then it's about elections. And often we sort of reverse that order. But, whenever you have democratization, democracy, let me put it this way, democracy in the long run brings stability. But democratization or young democracies are inherently actually unstable. Because the very first thing that an opening of a system does is actually to create winners and losers. The question is, how do you accommodate or bring in the losers, or whether or not they're willing to accept their loss? And in Iraq, I think early on, the Sunnis, through the insurgency, believed there was an option other than power sharing. They could actually get it back. If they pushed the US quickly enough and they hit the Shias hard enough, you could have a Sunni restoration in Baghdad. And part of the reason why the Shiites engaged in a counter-terror as of February 2006 is exactly to convince the other side that that's not going to happen. But our expectation that, a country in which there has been no practice of democracy, that has been based on specific suppression of a majority, Kurdish and Shia population, by a minority, people are just going to shake hands and say, from tomorrow we each will take what we want, and are not going to put up a resistance, is absurd. Even in the US, when, for instance, civil rights laws were passed, in the South there was resistance to it. And the resistance was because it was racial, but also because it meant something about distribution of power. A minority that was used to getting most of the power would now have to share it at the ballot box, and therefore there was resistance.
Is there any positive role that the Kurds can play in this?
Well, I think the Kurds are pretty much out of Iraq, and the only reason that they would abide by an Iraqi state is because an outright independence can cause trouble with Iran and Turkey. But there are key areas that are important. There is a constitutional renegotiation that is supposed to happen in the next few months, and if it's not successful, that will be the beginning of civil war. And then there is the status of Kirkuk, which is a city that the Kurds wanted back because Saddam relocated a lot of Arabs, particularly Shiites, to Kirkuk. They want to take the city back. The Arabs don't want to leave, so unless the Kurds are willing to negotiate over Kirkuk or negotiate over the constitution, they could contribute to aggravating the problem.
You mentioned that we may not have seen the worst of the sectarian violence. Are we heading toward a regional Shia-Sunni war, ignited first by the war in Iraq, then spreading to Lebanon, where the Shia are 45% of the population, and then the rest of the region?
Well, we can have a series of cascading conflicts. In other words, Lebanon, I think, may very well be in for a bout of sectarian conflict, because Hezbollah is coming out of this conflict very strong. It's going to lay claim to Lebanon. The entire issue of who speaks for Lebanon, who had the right to declare war, these are all issues that are going to be put forward. And Iraq may as I said, might become much more violent. If Iraq in particular becomes a civil war, without a doubt it will suck in the other regional countries around it, Iran and the parts of the Shias in one form or another, Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt and the like on the side of the Sunnis. I would say it's the Iran-Iraq war moved 200 kilometers west and refought again in the first decade of the 21st century. But I don't think, if in terms of a sustained long regional war, it's a question of it's a question of what is the relative power of each side, and obviously I think militarily Iran is probably the heavy weight in the region. In other words, without the U.S. getting involved, I don't see the other armies in the region being capable of, having a region-wide war against particularly Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah's configuration. But I think more likely is that you're going to have a series of conflicts, much like the one now, except more escalated, which were connected together, and there will be the same players in each of them on a particular side.
What can the United States do, if anything, in helping it prevent stop being a regional conflict or war?
Well, I think the first order of business is to try to bring the existing conflicts to a halt, particularly the one in Lebanon, as soon as possible, and to try to bring certain degree of stability to the region. The Middle East has become increasingly volatile. For varieties of reasons. There is insecurity among various population groups, the Sunnis because of Iraq or what Iraq might mean for them, now the Lebanon war. You have ongoing radicalization of the politics in the region as a consequence of these conflicts. A breath of sort of the stopping conflict, I think, is the most important thing. I think the one lesson we can learn out of Lebanon is that military conflict's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to change the political situation. It's actually rather going to aggravate it. And we need to sort of back away from allowing conflicts to go on in the hope that they would bring about a solution that we would like.
To what extent do you feel that the self-proclaimed decision makers of the U.S. government are aware of the ramifications that you have so aptly described?
I have no way of knowing that. All I can do is to sort of put the ideas and the arguments out there, hoping that people will read them. Please.
Thanks for an excellent presentation. It seems like a key to solving a lot of this problem is through Iran. Do you think that we should talk to Iran, just simply talk without preconditions? Do you think it would be useful? I know President Ahmadinejad sent President Bush a letter a couple weeks ago, and the president just dismissed it, which clearly there was a line in that letter that, I'm sure there probably wasn't much he could respond to, but he certainly could have used it as an opening to at least begin a dialogue. And secondly, along with that question, if you do think we should talk to Iran and engage in them in some sort of diplomacy, I was reading how in Iranian culture there's this very strong tendency to sort of, not say what you mean and give misdirection in speech. And I guess all cultures are prone to that a little bit. But I guess in Iran it's a very strong cultural tendency. So how would we, if we do decide to engage them, how would we overcome that? Do we have the capability if we wanted to engage them, do we have the capability to do it effectively?
Well, on the last part of your comment first, I think, diplomacy always involves a cultural challenge. I mean, we had similar kinds of difficulties. What is it that the Chinese want? I think Henry Kissinger once said, we play chess. They play on a sort of a frontal, and there's a Chinese game that he referred to. Their mentality about what is winning and losing is very different from ours. But that's always a challenge, to understand, what are the red lines and bottom lines and, expectations of the other side. I think there's enough, Iranian experts in this country and Iranian expatriates that can, for the U.S. government to draw on, that we can safely say that, Iran is not a sort of a deep hole that we can't understand. Iran is a challenge because it is a dictatorship. It's got a president right now that is a hardliner, that is militant, whose rhetoric does not serve his country or the situation in the region any favors. And there is a certain amount of danger in any authoritarian government that feels overconfident, that feels that feels itself to be a power on the rise. And I think Iran sort of has sometimes is reminiscent of Japan of 1930s. And therefore, we talking to Iran does not mean recognizing Iran. It does not mean that we sideline those issues that morally and politically we have difficulty with, such as support for democratic rights in Iran or human rights, or insisting on Iran suspend its support for terrorism and the like. I mean, those are issues that the U.S. should still push. But it's important. But we are also at a point where we assume that we could manage Iran with a varieties of tools, but no need for diplomacy. That was the one tool that we really didn't need. And, well, that's a risk, because even during the Soviet period, we always used diplomatic tools. In fact, you use diplomacy with your enemies, not with your friends. I mean, you should not need diplomacy with your friends. You can always appoint political appointees as ambassadors. It's not an issue to deal with. But we somehow decided that actually we don't need any diplomacy with our enemies. Now, the problem is the current strategy is not hitting its mark with Iran. I mean, we're not able to threaten them to submission. We're not able to give carrots through submission to get them to submit to the will of the international community. And, military option, I think, probably looks less attractive after Lebanon than it did before Lebanon. Because ultimately the lesson of Lebanon is, that overwhelming military power may very well not be able to get the job done. And then, end of the day, the one you're attacking actually becomes politically far more popular than it was before you attack them. And I think also it's the very first time in the region where we find ourselves sort of with one hand tied behind our back, because whenever we had problems with the Palestinian issue, other issues, we always relied on allies in the region to do what it needs to be done. So, we can always get Israelis to compromise on an issue or talk to them, and then it was the job of the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians to invite Arafat to Sharm el-Sheikh and give him a pep talk and get him to, do something. Well, this time, for the first time, there is nobody on the other side who, among our allies, who can talk to Hezbollah. So there's no way for us to really play that role without, at some level, having some kind of contact with Syria and Iran. And I again reiterate, I think talking to Iran, it does not mean that we're sort of throwing in the towel and we're accepting the Iranian regime and everything it wants. To the contrary, I think it's a matter of sort of trying to figure how can we maneuver Iran to where we want, through means other than the ones that are actually not currently working.
I think none of these states in the Middle East are really legitimate states. They're sovereign. But remember, all those boundaries were created by two men, one in particular, Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill, to Zionists and Wasps, is God. And you've got these clowns down the road here, think they're going to be Winston Churchill. What is happening is the collapse of the British Empire, finally. And the Americans are finally doing the job. We've got a reemergence of new successor states. Israel, Iran, when the Turks wake up, maybe Turkey too, carving up the Sunni heartland. I hope so. I'm a Shia, so I'll go for it. However, one of the things I'd like to know is that this trio of Cheney, Bush, and what's that guy's name? Colin Powell, did a double cross of the Shias in '91. And that really burnt. Here it was, rise up and we'll support you. Instead, arms and fuel were supplied to Saddam Hussein by Herr General, and the Shias were wiped out. And there was this enormous burning right through the Shia community about this. What happened? How come they did the same mistake twice, 3 times?
Well, the memory of that uprising is very important in Iraq. And essentially when the Shias rose up and expecting that the U.S. would support them, and then our regional allies, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, prevailed upon the U.S., saying that, a Shia Iraq would be pro-Iranian. You shouldn't support that uprising. The uprising collapsed. There are various estimates of how many Shiites were killed, upwards of 100,000 escaped to Iran. But estimates are as high as 300,000 Shias were killed, and those are the mass graves of southern Iraq that have been discovered since the fall of Saddam. And in fact, Saddam's regime after that became far more sectarian, because it was very clear that Sunni rule had to suppress an awakened Shia population. The reason it's important is because you have the same kind of issue going on. I mean, when Arab governments begin to sort of publicly call on Washington to abandon the Shia in Iraq, when they say things like, the Shias are going to be pro-Iranian and Iran is a pariah state, your enemy, why are you supporting them? Or when President Mubarak says, the Shias are always loyal to Iran, to Iraqi Shias that creates nervousness. There is a memory of when the same cabal influenced Washington to abandon the Shia, and in Iraq they talk of it as a second betrayal. And in fact, particularly when the U.S. ambassador in Iraq decided to bring the Sunnis into the process by beginning to put pressure on the Shias and began to flirt with Sunni leaders, there was an immediate warning in Iraq that the same events of 1991 are repeating. And the one reason that the Shias won't give up on their militias is because they don't trust the U.S. They don't trust that, ultimately, end of the day, there will not be another deal that would put them in a cage. And I think one of the important issues, and this is obviously the problem with the fact that Iran has been a theocracy and an anti-American state and is a pariah state, but the kind of influence that Sunnis have in Washington is not matched by the Shias. The United States hasn't talked to a Shia leader the past 29 years. And, even Nouri al-Maliki or Ibrahim Jafari simply don't have the same kind of access that King Abdullah and President Mubarak have. I think, in Paul Bremer's book, there is a very telling line where he's reporting to the president about the Shias in Iraq, and the president says, they tell me they're all liars. And who told the president they're all liars? Who has that kind of access to educate the president on what he ought to think about the Shias? And that kind of access the Shias don't have, and because they don't have it, there is a great deal of anxiety about what the ultimate U.S. intentions might be.
Thank you. The last month or so, I started looking at some of the different plans. There's a 28-point plan that they were discussing in Cairo, and a 21-point plan about resolving the issue. And right now, people from Code Pink went over to Jordan to discuss with some of the Iraqi people based on the Cairo, and there were some disagreements. So I solicited some discussion from people in the field of conflict, experts in the field of conflict resolution internationally, and actually we wrote up some underlying principles that would underlie any plan. Like for example, the occupation. As long as there's an occupation, it's going to split everybody in two, and they can't even think. There's no way they can resolve the problems. That the parties themselves have to resolve their problems, that all the parties have to come to the table, even the extreme ones. Like now you bring Hamas and Hezbollah, and by excluding them, you make them more violent and needing expert. So anyway, I'm just curious if you're familiar with the plan, and if anybody is using any people with expertise in the body of knowledge on conflict studies.
I'm not familiar with the specifics of the plans, but I think all of these plans have a problem, is that the bigger forces in the region, which is, for instance, in this case, Iran, their vested interests don't often coincide with what is in these plans. In other words, because they're exactly because they're not sitting at the table, so they're not. You don't have their buy-in into whatever you're going to agree to, and they don't believe that their positions are represented or protected. And they have a vested interest, in fact, in undermining it. I don't think any of these, it's not just a matter of, in my opinion, of only bringing the parties within together. You have to acknowledge that these parties have regional sponsors, whether we like it or not. That's a fact. And there are good ones, there are bad ones. Some of them have relations with the U.S., some are U.S. enemies. But this is the reality. And I think the model that actually worked is the model of the Bonn Conference and Afghanistan, where when the Taliban government fell, there was a conference that was held in Bonn, And all the regional actors came, including Iran. And there was intense negotiations between Ambassador Khalilzad, who's now in Iraq, and the Iranian ambassador at the United Nations. Although neither side wanted to advertise that these contacts occurred. And the consequence of that was that Afghanistan had a rapid transition to the Karzai government at the beginning and got a constitution in relatively quick order. Because everybody at that time understood that doesn't matter how many warlords you bring. If the Pakistanis and the Iranians are not there, and the Uzbeks are not there, it doesn't matter what these groups agree to. It's not going to hold unless you have those forces at the table as well.
Hi.
Excuse me, could everyone just please keep their questions very short so that we can accommodate everyone who has a question? Thanks.
I have a simple question. What do you think it's going to take for the people living in Muslim countries to move into the modern world by adopting more of a live and let live attitude, give up victimhood, give up jihad, give up honor killings, give up sectarian violence, stop scapegoating Israel, and I mean, what do you propose as a scheme? Could you comment on that? I mean, I see trying to get honest leaders and moderating the religion and trying to get something the equivalent of a Radio Free Europe.
Well, you know, it's that what you're saying is a tall order, but I mean, none of these are going to happen very quickly, and elsewhere it hasn't happened. It requires a process that begins to reduce conflict in the region, and also gradually begins to open the political systems in the region. There are maladies in the political process in the Middle East, and nothing's going to move forward until those maladies are addressed. The same thing could have been said about Northern Ireland, which was or about the Basque region in Spain, where seemingly it was engaged in a kind of political behavior that didn't fit Europe, and there was an enormous amount of hatred between communities, and ultimately the understanding was that you have to have a process that engages and tries to deal with the core issue in those societies. And I think there's no simple answer here, but you know, the beginning would be to deal with what are the sources of maladies in the region.
Two things. One is there a connection between the Iranian-U.S. conflict over the Iran's atomic project and the Hezbollah and Hamas starting their conflicts with Israel?
Well, we don't know for sure whether or not what kind of a role Iran had in starting this conflict. Many Iranian leaders claim that the conflict really began a year ago when Prime Minister Hariri was assassinated, and once the U.S. began to push Syria out of Lebanon, they assumed that there would be a war. So it's a matter of when actually it would start. But there is no doubt that whether or not Iran was directly involved, it has in many ways benefited. One is that, yes, the United Nations is now bogged down in too much in Lebanon to address Iran's resolution. Secondly, Iran has underscored something that it always wanted, that that the U.S. recognizes that it matters, that it holds the cards not only in Iraq but in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, and the like, and that you can't have peace and stability without Iran. They wanted to underscore this. Iranian leaders have been saying these kinds of things, that, you know, the U.S. doesn't understand, you know, how important Iran is, and they've achieved that. And also they've had other benefits in this war. One is that they've seen in this war a sort of degrading of the power of military solutions. Secondly is that they've, even at a low level, they began to showcase and test new weapon systems that have proven quite surprising: anti-tank missiles, you know, rockets, unmanned drones, and the like. And all of these are designed to make signals to the West about, what might it expect if it were to attack Iran. So in many ways, it's helped them. And then they look at the growing anti-Americanism on the street in the Arab world. They look at the weakening of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt as a consequence of this war. And they see Hezbollah's popularity, and then they make a calculation that their hand is a lot stronger now. So they don't need to compromise. So whether they intended it or not, they are the beneficiary, and it makes dealing with them a lot more difficult.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Considering the history of the United States in the Middle East, and sort of we've always done a lot of stuff in other people's names but for our own benefit, what role should the United States play at this point? In other words, should we start backing out? Should we take a leadership role? In other words, are we messing things more up? Being there, what should we do?
Well, I think in many ways we're stuck between a stone and a hard place. Leaving the Middle East is not an option. Even leaving Iraq in some ways is not an option. Even if we end up having to do it for domestic pressure, it's not a good solution, mainly because we cannot leave a territory like Iraq to its own devices without a government and a military that can establish law and order. We learned in Afghanistan that you cannot have a free zone, particularly one which already is infested with the worst kinds of terrorism and militancy. And secondly, if Iraq falls apart in a major way, it will impact the entire rim of the Persian Gulf. And we have energy interests, we have security interests, and the like. So in some ways, the decision just to leave, particularly leave Iraq, is not a simple one. I think the only major difference is that we have thought for a while now that there is a sort of a razor-sharp knife of military option that can sort of cut through the Gordian knot of the problems in the region and solve them. And we learn now that that's not that easy, that knife has become increasingly blunt, and it actually causes other problems. So that's my suggestion, that we need to think of other mechanisms to address what our interests are. In other words, we still have a problem with Iran because it's a dictatorial regime that has negative influence in many regards on the region, supports terrorism and the like. It's a big problem if it were to acquire nuclear weapons. So, I mean, that's still a problem. The question is not that we should forget those problems. The question is that we have to find a different way of tackling them that would be more productive.
Could you elaborate on your analogy of Iran to Japan in the 30s? That's a fairly dire kind of outcome.
It is. I mean, history is replete with examples. You can think of Prussia, you can think of also China in the 1960s and the like. But Iran is if you would, is a rising power in the region. In other words, it is self-consciously sees itself as a regional power. It has the economic wherewithal, it has the military wherewithal, it has the size, it has the population base to assert its position. Even if you look economically, Iran's gross domestic output is almost twice that of Saudi Arabia and is well above that of Egypt. And that's not accounting for industrial production, which Saudis don't have much of. But at the same time, this is not a sort of a peaceful rise. In other words, domestically, Iran is an authoritarian regime which is, after a seeming turn in the direction of reform a decade ago, is turning again in the direction of a combination of ideological militancy and sort of rabid nationalism. And it's increasingly ruled also by a military class. In other words, when we think of Iran, we think of clerics, because that sort of has become the iconic face of Iran. But Iran is in fact now increasingly run by commanders from the Revolutionary Guards. Even the Iranian president is a veteran of the Guards. They control a lot of the economy, many aspects of security and politics. And so you have a military class in Iran that is nationalistic, is highly ideological, and it sees, it's Iran on a power binge and wants to assert that power. And it might not be that Iran will actually engage in conquest the way Japan did. This is a different time period, but there is no doubt that Iran wants to leave its mark on the region, and it's on the conflicts we see, the way it's exerting its influence is a consequence of that. In part, Iran's problem with the U.S. is that it sees the U.S. as an obstacle to its free reign over the region.
Thank you for your remarks. I wanted to ask you to focus a little bit on Syria in a number of different ways. One, you have a non-Shia government very much supporting a Shia movement in Hezbollah. How does that work out in terms of Syrian policy? Does Syria control Hezbollah or influence Hezbollah more than Iran does? Is it about equal? What are the different relations there? And also, how does Syria's role with regard to, in the past at least, wanting to negotiate with Israel about the return of the Golan relate to its policy with regard to supporting Hezbollah and other Shia groups?
Well, the second part of your question, without a doubt, Syria has issues with Israel. There's issues of territory and there's issues of strategic balance, particularly since Syria was pushed out of Lebanon. Essentially, it lost a lot of strategic ground to Israel. It's far more militarily vulnerable than when it was in Lebanon. And without a doubt, the Syrians very quickly said that, this is not about 2 Israeli soldiers kidnapped. This is about the entire Arab-Israeli conflict. So they wanted to very quickly focus the light on the overall issue as opposed to just the immediate issue. Now, the Alawis, which is the minority community of about 10% which rules over Syria, is not Shia, but its lineage is through Shiism. In other words, the Alawis are an offshoot of Shiism that sort of went on a tangent, and in some ways its practices are not Islamic. It doesn't follow Islamic law. It includes Zoroastrian, ancient Iranian practices in it. But in some ways, therefore, in the eyes of the Muslim Brotherhood and the hardline Sunnis, it was even worse than the Shias. It was even further removed than the Shias. There are old medieval fatwas by eminent jurists who declared the Alawis to be heretics. And one of the ways when there was gradually an Islamic revival in the Middle East, the Assad regime, which has been ruling Syria, which always had a sort of a secular face and advocated all the Arab causes, turned to a senior Shia cleric in Lebanon, Imam Musa Sadr, and then to Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, both of whom issued fatwas declaring Alawis to be Shias and therefore to be Muslims. So it is not in other words, whatever connection the Alawis have to Islam is through Shiism, not through Sunnism. And but the relationship is tactical. Syria was always Iran's ally during the Iran-Iraq conflict. It was the only Arab country who supported Iran. Both of them have been supporting Hezbollah. I think Iran's relationship to Hezbollah is far more important than Syria's. Syria has a closer tactical relationship to Hezbollah, particularly when it was the ruler of Lebanon. But Iran's relationship is both far deeper and is culturally and historically and militarily far more important. I think Syria always was sort of the place through which Iran's influence worked itself into Lebanon, and then Syria did the micromanagement of the scene in Lebanon. But as we're seeing now, it's really Iran's military financial support that accounts for Hezbollah, not Syria's.
Yes, thank you very much for your very enlightening talk. I haven't read your book, but I hope that you have, just so that everybody here gets things in context, I hope you have pointed out that in 1400 years of history across the Muslim world, barring the conflicts which invariably are the human lot, not only have the Shia and the Sunni lived relatively at peace, but the Christians, Jews, Hindus, and X number of religions have lived in very much a case of relative peace in that period. Yes, but this is just building up to that, because I think we should not even forget the context that, the two biggest conflicts have been in Europe. But within this context, what I want to say is that a lot of the legacy of what we're seeing today is a very mixed legacy of colonialism, of, yes, a certain amount of backwardness of a period that, they went through. But we seem to be ignoring also the 800-pound gorilla in the room, because there's Saudi Arabia, which actually has probably been, no, that's what I'm asking him, that where does he see the role of Saudi Arabia in bringing a more tolerant Middle East?
Well, the points you make are quite apt. In other words, there is like every religion, like every civilization. That's right. Without every civilization has periods of harmony as well as division, and without a doubt, even though, as I even have written in the book, people read their sacred text in a context. So it has to make meaning to hopes and aspirations and fears that they have. So there is difference. There are differences in how people interpret things over time, and we have to definitely look at, what kind of historical baggage, what kind of immediate problems. Is it colonialism? Is it economic problems, class, whatever it is, that accounts for certain things flaring up? Protestants and Catholics fought everywhere, but it finished. Why is it continuing in Northern Ireland? You have to look at that. So it's not just the history of what Luther said to Pope that matters there. But Saudi Arabia poses a particular challenge because, well, aside from the fact, and I think other people have said plenty, that its form of practice of Sunnism is particularly conservative, is particularly intolerant of other interpretations of Sunnism, let alone Shiism. But its influence in recent years, because of oil money, because of various issues, has become far more prevalent. In other words, in places where there was far more tolerance, for instance, in India and Pakistan and the like, the Saudi influence has been to make to sort of distance these communities. And the fact that Saudi Arabia went into a Cold War with Iran during the Iranian Revolution period gave it every incentive to promote anti-Shia policies, because it believes Shias were likely Iran's Trojan horses in different places. But also there is a particularly bloody history between Shias right where, in Iraq, Saudi Arabia region, and the Wahhabi sect of Saudi Arabia. And this is just, particular to there. Namely, when the House of Saud took power on the Arabian Peninsula as the sword of the Wahhabi religion and created the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there were pogroms of Shias. And that legacy is very strong in the minds of Shias. And it is very strong in the minds of Iraqi Shias, because the Wahhabi armies invaded southern Iraq a number of times and particularly destroyed the shrine of Hussein in Karbala. So every time there's a bombing in Iraq, even Ayatollah Sistani, others say, well, it's not Iraqis who are doing it, it's Wahhabis who are doing it. Well, it's convenient to say, well, it's outsiders, don't take revenge on your neighbors. But they are also evoking this memory that, look, yet again it's repeating. And particularly with the shrine of Samarra, it was, for the Shias of Iraq, is very reminiscent of the destruction of the shrine of Karbala. So, yes, I think it's very important for Iran to play a positive role in the region, but it's also very important for Saudi Arabia to do so as well. And I think we should focus on both of them to try to contribute to stability rather than to compete and create instability.
Inexorably, as America moves toward an election, they simplify stay in or get out of Iraq into an oversimplified question. You said we cannot just get out. Beyond the military and maybe getting the power and the water back, what strategies and what credibility do we have to work through Iraq or to dialogue, and with whom or through whom?
Well, I think that it's already shown that the U.S. has a very difficult time trying to talk to everybody at once. And you have to create a framework for compromise and negotiations. The U.S. occupation presence in Iraq is not a framework. It is just a law and order force at best. It's not a framework that everybody in the region would believe that they had a seat at the table. Their interest in Iraq was served. The interests of their clients were served, and can convince their clients that the compromise and the final deal is a good one. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. In other words, the U.S. didn't take it upon itself to talk to every warlord. We talked to some, but we talked to their masters. And that proved to be a far more viable solution. And I still think that we cannot impose a compromise on the Shias without the help of their patrons, which is Iran. And we cannot really get the Sunnis to accept a final outcome without getting the Saudis and the Jordanians, the Egyptians on board. Well, with the Kurds, we are the patron, so we can, sort of, because there's nobody else, and they trust the U.S. But you cannot have it without the participation of everybody.